My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 45 years old, and until 8:37 this morning, I was the Chief Client Officer at Virion Health Tech. I spent 15 years building the company's client portfolio from scratch, forging partnerships, fixing disasters at 2 a.m., and nursing deals that no one else could close. I was sitting in the Monday leadership meeting, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug I'd had since our Series A, days when Marcus, the CEO, looked at me with that executive smile of his and said the words, "Your services are no longer required." 7 words. No context, no explanation, not even a pause to let them sink in. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him, but the silence in the room told me otherwise. Every eye turned downward, suddenly fascinated with notebooks, laptops, and the texture of the conference room table. My heart dropped so fast it felt like I'd been shoved from a rooftop. I looked at Marcus, searching for some hint of a joke. His expression didn't change. Cold, practiced, impersonal. The same face he used with investors when he was spinning bad numbers. I turned to Dana, our VP of Operations, someone who used to text me at midnight for advice on how to navigate vendor pushback. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Neither would Raj, our CFO, who once sobbed in my office after his divorce. People I'd worked with, celebrated with, and cried with. Now they looked through me like I wasn't even there. Marcus cleared his throat like he was reading from a well-rehearsed script. "We've decided to move the department in a new direction. Jake will be taking over your responsibilities effective immediately." That's when I felt it more insult than shock. Jake, his nephew, a 29-year-old with a fancy MBA and 7 months of coasting inside the company. The same kid who asked me last week how to spell Medicaid, the same one who called our most strategic partner by the wrong name in a live meeting, and now he was taking my seat. I managed to say, "I see," but my voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else watching this unfold. "When did the board vote on this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus didn't flinch. "Emergency session," he said. "Late Friday." I stared at Raj again. He looked like he might cry, but he didn't say a word. Dana suddenly needed to check her calendar. A manila envelope slid across the table toward me. "HR has prepared a transition package," Marcus added. "You'll find it more than generous." Generous. That word echoed in my mind like a slap, as if this were a favor, as if 15 years of sacrifice could be wrapped in some severance check and a confidentiality clause. I didn't touch the envelope. I just said quietly I was here when we signed our first hospital contract on a napkin in a diner. I was here when our biggest client almost walked, and I flew overnight to fix it. I was here when no one else wanted to answer the phones on Christmas Eve. Marcus nodded, unmoved. "We appreciate your contributions, Claire, but it's time for a fresh perspective." That was when I understood. It wasn't about strategy or performance. It was about power. About clearing the path for someone to manage. Someone with the right bloodline. I stood up, hands surprisingly steady. "I'll pack my things." "Take the day," Marcus said, with forced warmth. "Security will escort you when you're ready." And that was it. Just like that, I was no longer part of the company I'd helped shape with everything I had. I looked around the room once more. Not one person met my gaze. Not one had the courage. I walked out into the hallway, head high, even as my stomach twisted itself into knots. The people I passed avoided eye contact. Some looked guilty, others relieved. I could already feel the shift. The same people who called me their rock last week would be lining up to congratulate Jake before lunchtime. 15 years. I'd given them my time, my relationships, my weekends, and every ounce of loyalty. They gave me 7 words, but underneath the shock and humiliation, something else stirred, something heavier, something sharper. They thought I'd disappear quietly, that I'd fade into the background like I never mattered. They didn't know me at all, and that I realized would be their first mistake. I stood in the doorway of my office, staring at everything and nothing all at once. The view of the city skyline stretched across the wide glass window, but I'd barely noticed it in years. My desk was neat, obsessively, so except for the small ceramic mug with a chipped rim and the framed photo of my niece at her high school graduation, I grabbed a cardboard box from the supply closet and set it down gently on the chair, the kind of chair I used to nap in during all-nighters before launches. Each item I picked up felt heavier than it should have. The branded notebook from our first investor pitched the stress ball I never used, but always kept near, and the award they gave me for saving the Pacific Care deal in 2014. I reached for the jade plant on the windowsill, a gift from my mom when I first made VP. She told me then it would grow if I did. I'd barely watered it, but somehow it had survived, stubborn and green in a world of glass and steel. Unlike my relationships, which had quietly withered under the weight of long hours, emergency flights, and the promise that next quarter things would slow down, I tucked away my emergency flats from under the desk, the ones I wore after 12-hour trade shows and client dinners that ran late into the night. I wrapped them in a scarf that still smelled faintly of bergamot, reminding me of the partner retreat in Napa I'd missed my cousin's wedding for. Somewhere in the middle of the packing, a wave of something raw and painful rose in my chest. I'd missed birthdays, anniversaries. The last Thanksgiving was with my dad before his stroke. All for this. For the meetings, the deadlines, the numbers that were never quite good enough. My calendar had been color-coded not with life events, but with back-to-back calls and quarterly targets. 15 years collapsed into one sad cardboard box. One life in service of a company that had decided I was no longer required. I glanced at the door plaque with my name on it. Claire Bennett, CCO. It suddenly looked out of place, like a relic from a story that no longer existed. I looked around the room once more. The whiteboard with last quarter's strategy was still scribbled in blue marker. The stack of training manuals I'd written from scratch. The half-used notepads with scribbled reminders in my handwriting. Traces of a woman who'd been here, who'd mattered. But now, even the air felt different, like the room itself was preparing for someone new. Someone with less history. Someone with the right bloodline. My fingers tightened around the pen I always carried in meetings, the one I used to sign our first $1 million deal. For a second, I considered leaving it behind like a gesture of goodwill. But then I slipped it into my purse. That goodwill had expired the moment Marcus handed Jake my future. Grief was still there, but it was changing, hardening, becoming something with more edge. I'd spent so long asking for permission to be part of the decisions, to lead, to matter. And now they'd answered, just not in the way I expected. I sealed the box and sat down at the desk for what might be the last time. I didn't cry. I just sat there letting the silence remind me of everything I'd given up to be here. The thing was, they thought they'd erased me by asking me to leave. But all they'd done was remind me what I'd been holding up, and what might fall apart without me. I was sitting in my car, still parked in the Virion garage, when my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to answer. Not another pity call. Not another vague message from someone too scared to speak up in the boardroom. But the number flashing on my screen stopped me cold. It was a New York area code, not one I recognized. Something in me hesitated, thumb hovering. Then I picked up. Claire Bennett, I said, my voice clipped, still wearing the mask of professionalism, like armor I hadn't removed yet. Claire. Elaine Monroe. Her name landed like a stone in my stomach. CEO of Vaximed, Virion's biggest competitor. I'd heard her voice in keynote addresses and earnings calls, but never directly. I didn't speak. I couldn't figure out why she was calling or how she even got my number. She got right to the point. I heard what happened this morning. Her tone was calm but precise, like someone who never wasted words. What they did was short-sighted. I'd like to meet. Just the suggestion made my pulse tick faster. I was still reeling from being thrown out of the house I helped build. And now, the woman we'd tried to outmaneuver for years was calling me. I asked her why. Not out of politeness, but because I needed to know what this was. Elaine didn't flinch. Because you were the reason Virion worked, and because people like Marcus are good at making enemies out of their best people. She told me she was flying into Boston and would be at the Dorchester at 5. Tea lounge, no entourage, just her. The line went dead before I could even say yes. I sat there with the phone still to my ear, heart pounding in my chest. Part of me was flattered, maybe even vindicated. But another part whispered caution. This was a woman who played to win. She'd eaten executives alive before breakfast. If I wasn't careful, I could go from discarded to devoured. Still, she had seen something. Where Marcus saw a threat, she saw opportunity. It wasn't just the call itself, it was the timing, the precision. She hadn't hesitated. While my former colleagues were sending me vague emojis and excuses, Elaine Monroe picked up the phone and moved. That alone said everything. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My lipstick was faded, eyes were still glassy from earlier. I fixed both, straightened my blazer, and started the car. It wasn't a yes, not yet. But I knew I was going to that meeting, not because I needed a job, but because someone in this industry still remembered what I was worth. That call didn't erase the betrayal, but it cracked open a window where everything had felt closed. Maybe I hadn't reached the end of the road. Maybe this was the first step towards something even bigger. Or maybe it was a trap. Either way, I wasn't going to sit quietly and wonder. I was going to find out. I was halfway through organizing the box in my apartment when my phone rang again. The number looked familiar, but it took a second before I realized who it was. Eileen Mercer, Chief Medical Officer at Mayo Health. We'd worked together for nearly a decade through system overhauls, billing nightmares, and late-night crisis calls. Her voice always carried authority, but now it held something else. Concern. She didn't waste time. Marcus had called personally to reassure her there would be no disruption, that his nephew would be handling the account directly from now on. She let that sit in the air for a moment, then said what she really called to say. Claire, we didn't choose Virion because of Marcus. We chose it because of you. I stood there with a coffee mug in one hand, stunned. The woman I'd spent years supporting was now offering something I hadn't expected. Clarity. She reminded me of the first implementation year, how I showed up during a weekend system crash and stayed until it was fixed. I always told them the truth, even when it was bad news. She said that trust didn't come from logos or leadership titles. It came from me. That was the moment I felt something click back into place, something I hadn't even realized was missing. Dignity. The kind that doesn't come from position, but from being truly seen. I asked what this meant practically. She paused, then said they were beginning vendor evaluations soon. They'd appreciate an independent perspective from someone who understood their operations better than anyone. She didn't say it outright, but it was clear. They wanted to work with me, not the company, not the brand. Me? I told her I needed some time. She said, of course, and added one last thing before hanging up. Whatever you choose next, make sure they know what they're getting. When the call ended, I sat down at my dining table, surrounded by the pieces of my professional life packed in a box. But for the first time since that boardroom ambush, I didn't feel discarded. I felt needed. Not by a title. By people who had seen me at work and decided I was the reason they stayed. That was power. And it had nothing to do with office doors or nameplates. The call came late in the evening, just as I was wrapping up notes for a potential consulting proposal. I didn't recognize the number right away, but something told me to answer. Marcus. His voice was warm, too warm, like he was trying to wrap regret in charm. He said they'd been re-evaluating the situation, that the transition hadn't gone as smoothly as they'd hoped. He mentioned morale momentum and client trust, all the things that used to fall under my name without anyone ever needing to ask. Then came the offer. A senior advisory role, flexible, lucrative. They'd match any number, add a bonus, and give me my own team. It sounded generous, on paper. But I could hear it in his voice. Desperation. Not respect. Not an apology. Just a man trying to stop the bleeding with a checkbook. I let him finish. Then I took a breath and told him I appreciated the call, but I wasn't interested. Not now, not ever. He asked if it was about the money. I almost laughed. It was never about the money, Marcus. It was about being replaced by someone who couldn't explain the product to a third grader, someone you trusted more than me because he shared your last name. He got quiet. I could imagine him sitting at that same desk where he handed me the envelope thinking this was a fixable PR moment. But this wasn't damage control. This was a consequence. I told him I'd found clarity since leaving. I remembered what it felt like to build something that mattered, and this time, I'd be building it for someone who knew my value before it was convenient. He tried one last angle, said I was being emotional. I smiled. No, Marcus. I'm being strategic. You taught me that. I wished him luck. And I meant it in the most distant, detached way possible. After I hung up, I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. I just sat there with a quiet satisfaction pulsing through me, not because I'd said no, but because I hadn't needed to say yes. That's the power they never understood. When you finally stop waiting for validation, you realize you were the value all along. Walking into Vaxamed's Boston office felt like shedding an old skin. The space was smaller, less polished than Virion's glass tower, but it buzzed with a different kind of energy. Purposeful, hungry. And for the first time in years, I wasn't walking into someone else's system. I was building my own. Elaine handed me the reins and didn't look back. No micromanaging, no condescension, no second guessing. She told me to build the client operations I always believed in, the one I could never fully create, inside a bureaucracy designed to suppress change. I started by gutting the existing playbook. Too many steps. Too little heart. I designed a new framework that focused on relationships, not transactions. Clients didn't want scripted check-ins. They wanted honesty, anticipation, someone who understood them before they had to explain themselves. I brought in 2 analysts I'd worked with years ago. Both had been overlooked, passed over for promotions while babysitting executives who couldn't run a pivot table. They were sharp, fast, and loyal. I didn't have to explain the mission. They saw it clearly. We weren't there to compete with Virion's structure. We were there to replace it. I rebuilt the client dashboard from scratch, streamlined the reporting cadence, created a red flag protocol so issues surfaced before they turned into client rage. And I picked up the phone. Not just to answer questions, but to start conversations. I asked what kept our partners up at night. Then we solved those problems before they were even official. Within weeks, clients who had felt like numbers started calling back with real interest. 2 mid-size hospital systems signed on in under a month, not because we lowballed the competition, because they trusted what we were building. I didn't work less, but this time the effort felt clean. It wasn't about proving my worth to a boardroom full of detached executives. It was about honoring the value I knew I brought and shaping something that reflected it. There was no glamour yet. My desk wobbled. My office had a view of a loading dock. But the emails I sent the systems I wrote, the team I led, they all had my fingerprints. No interference, no politics, no legacy egos to navigate. I didn't need an empire handed to me. I just needed a foundation. And now, brick by brick, I was building something that felt real. Something that finally had my name written all over it. It started quietly. A short article in a trade newsletter mentioned Virion losing one of its longest-standing hospital accounts. No details, just a vague quote from a spokesperson about shifting priorities and internal restructuring. Then came the messages. A former colleague texted that the Westbridge contract had fallen through. Another said Jake froze during a presentation, unable to answer a basic compliance question. The systems I once held together with instinct and insight were unraveling, and I hadn't touched a thing. I'd simply stepped away. Mayo made their move next. Officially, they were conducting a vendor review. Unofficially, they'd stopped returning Marcus's calls. Word spread faster than I expected. Virion's name became a cautionary whisper in meetings, a warning to companies who thought people were interchangeable. Suddenly, the logo on the slide deck wasn't enough to earn trust. Then the headlines hit. One publication ran a piece on leadership instability at Virion. Another leaked an internal memo showing Marcus was stepping down, citing burnout. But anyone who had been in those rooms knew better. He wasn't tired. He was cornered. And Jake didn't even make it that far. Removed from his position with no public explanation. I watched it all from across the river. My new office had a perfect view of the tower I used to call home. Lights still came on in the morning. People still showed up, but the pulse had changed. The foundation was crumbling, and no one could quite figure out why. But I knew. I had been the invisible thread that kept it stitched together. The bridge between clients and chaos, the quiet fixer. They mistook that quiet for replaceable. But what they lost wasn't noise. It was gravity. I didn't gloat. I didn't leak stories or take calls from journalists fishing for quotes. I didn't have to. Truth doesn't need a microphone when the silence starts to echo. I hadn't burned anything down. I just stopped holding up the beams. And without someone keeping the weight in balance, the collapse was only a matter of time. It wasn't revenge. It was released. Letting go of something that never saw me clearly and watching it fall under the weight of its own blindness. The morning light spilled across my new office floor, warm and soft against the glass. From where I stood, I could see the top floors of the Virion building across the river. It looked smaller from here, like a relic from another lifetime, instead of the place where I once poured in everything I had. I sipped my coffee slowly. No rush, no meetings I was dreading. Just quiet. Purposeful. My calendar held calls with partners. I respected people who valued collaboration over ego. There were no fire drills, no scrambling to patch cracks in a system I no longer had to carry. My laptop chimed. One new email. The subject line read, "Contract finalized." It was from Mayo, their renewal, signed, sealed, and awarded to us. I sat back and stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the words settle into something real, not because I needed proof. But it marked the end of one story and the full beginning of another. I thought back to that Tuesday morning, the envelope, the hallway, the silence. How 7 words nearly unraveled 15 years of effort. And how instead of breaking me, it cleared the path for something cleaner, sharper. Mine. I didn't build Vaxamed's momentum on bitterness. I built it on clarity, on knowing what I brought to the table and refusing to shrink just because others were afraid of my presence. I wasn't the assistant anymore. I wasn't the fixer behind the scenes. I was the architect. And now I have to draw the whole blueprint. Outside, the wind picked up tugging at the edge of a banner flapping on a nearby rooftop. I let myself smile. The old building still stood. But the life I had in it was over, and that wasn't a tragedy. That was freedom. The truth is, sometimes the most powerful revenge doesn't come with headlines or applause. It's not about who falls. It's about where you rise. I didn't need to destroy what failed to see me. I just needed to create what finally did. I closed the email, leaned back in my chair, and looked out the window again. It didn't matter who was sitting in my old office now. What mattered was who I had become once I left it. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't being brought back. It's exactly where you were always meant to be, seen, respected, fully yourself, in a place that finally gets it.